everyone, I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with authors and journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. So from its inception, America built its foundation on inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And while that may not have been true for everyone in America, one person did make that their mission. Author Nina Sankovitch tells us a really fascinating story about someone who went by the name of Public Universal Friend. And they were a preacher from Rhode Island. And you've probably never heard of this person, even if you are very well versed in American history, which I would consider myself to be. That was my major. But Public Universal Friend had a spiritual awakening and set forth to create a community that would strive for that pursuit of happiness and for America to be a place of equality and opportunity, regardless of race, sex, or religion. So now we have Nina, who has written this fascinating new book. It's called Not Your Founding Father, How a Non-Binary Minister Became America's Most Radical Revolutionary. Nina, I'm so excited that you're here to talk to us about this book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here to talk about Universal Friend, whom I was also an American history major and had never heard of Universal Friend.
Oh, good. I'm not alone. Okay. Well, I couldn't help but thinking as I was going through your book that, this is the year that America turns 250. And so you chose this episode from our country's history that, very few people know about. So tell us how you came across Jemima Wilkinson, who would later become Public Universal Friend, and why did you decide to highlight their story now?
Okay. Well, I came across the story of Universal Friend when I was researching my last book, which was called American Rebels, How the Hancocks, Adams, and Quincy families fanned the flames of revolution. And in my research, I was looking at ministers who actually also helped fan the flames of revolution. They played a huge role in bringing colonists on board with the fight for independence. So much so that King George called it the Parsons Rebellion because so many ministers were involved. So then I came across this minister who actually preached against the war, preached against war in general, and didn't get all involved in the fight for independence. And I thought, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. And then I realized this minister was someone who claimed to be a non-gendered messenger sent by God to save the world. Well, that's really interesting. I didn't even realize that there was an acknowledgement at that time of a possibility of being non-gendered, or what we call non-binary. And in the title of my book, we have non-binary. Obviously, that wasn't a term used in the 18th century, but it turns out Universal Friend claimed to be neither male nor female, so clearly was non-binary, and clearly was not in promoting war, but did promote the ideals for which the revolution was being fought. So the revolution ends, and all the ministers and men who had been advocating voraciously for freedom and liberty, and who had basically made a promise to the colonists, if we win this fight, if we win independence, we're going to be a nation of equality, of freedom, of liberty, of opportunity. And so a lot of women and free blacks and enslaved blacks signed on for the war for independence because they thought, great, this is a promise, we're going to be free. Mm-hmm. War ends, didn't quite work out that way, in part because the founders were really busy with keeping the country, this new country of the United States, afloat. There were so many problems, mostly money problems. They had run out of money. They had huge war debts. So these promises of liberty and equality for all went to the back burner. Mm-hmm. The pendulum that had swung so far forward for independence now swung back, basically solidifying the rights of free white men. Mm-hmm. Boom. They were the ones who held the power in the new country.
And that's really the story of America, about this pendulum and the promise of liberty, equality for all and what that means in the fight for it. And then when more and more people are able to fight for their rights, then there's the inevitable backlash.
Right.
And so this is just a fascinating chapter in that story that's not very well known, I think.
Right. We don't often talk about what happened after the revolution until we get almost to, the lead up to the Civil War. It's like this huge space we don't talk about where the promises of the revolution were not really kept. So how interesting to find that this minister who became a minister in 1776, another I find fascinating coincidence. So the same year that we're celebrating the birth of our nation, the signing of the Declaration of Independence and this promise of rights, that same year, Jemima Wilkinson, a young Quaker woman from Rhode Island, she falls deathly ill. The family's basically planning the funeral, but one morning wakes up and says, I'm fine. In fact, I did die, but I've been reborn. I am God's messenger, sent to save souls, sent to save the world, and starting here in America, starting here in Rhode Island, began preaching Rhode Island. And right away drew attention, not only because the minister claimed to be, non-gendered, but the minister wore these long robes, wore hair loose, which women didn't do that time, wore uncovered head, which men didn't do at that time. Got this very ambiguous look. Went out on horseback, riding over the hills of Rhode Island with followers trying to catch behind. Universal Friend was an excellent horseman. And gathering followers by preaching very much sort of typical sermons of fire and brimstone, like you will go to hell if you don't repent. But at the same time saying, you are all equal before God, you all can repent. Now this was new. Universal Friend wasn't saying some of you are predestined to damnation. Universal Friend wasn't saying, and men, you step forward because you're better than women, and women are the ones responsible anyway because Eve gave Adam that apple. Universal Friend instead said everyone is equal before God. Doesn't matter if you're male, female, black, white, Native American, everyone is equal. Now this was a pretty revolutionary concept. And Friend required that anyone who joined the sect had to manumit any slaves they might have. So again, pretty revolutionary. And when the war finally ended and there was all this backtracking on the promises of freedom and equality, Universal Friend and followers said, well, we're going to go create a community. And it's not like Universal Friend was waving the Declaration of Independence saying, I'm going to create a community based on the Declaration. Instead, Friend said, I'm going to build a community where everybody is free to be who they are, free to pursue the economic opportunities they want to. We'll give them support. We'll help them out. We are a community of faith, and we are going to show our faith by being grateful for everything God's given us, by being happy for everything God's given us, and by being good people who care about everybody. So set up these communities. And there in those communities, blacks and whites, men and women, lived side by side without a lot of these rules. For example, like the Shakers had rules separating the sects and prohibiting sexual activity and telling you what you could wear and when you could eat and when you went to bed. But Friends communities weren't like that. They were basically villages, but villages where everybody had a voice in the community, equal rights, property rights. And that was an amazing revolutionary thing.
Yeah. That really is. And I can't help but talk a little bit about where we are today, because obviously there is a great fight going on for the rights of non-binary and transgender Americans. And there's been quite a backlash to that. It seems that just maybe a couple decades ago, we're having the same conversation about rights for gay and lesbian and bisexual Americans as well. And I'm seeing some parallels because in the political context, there is this argument about, oh, well, this is a new thing. We're just now dealing with this. When in reality, of course, there have been LGBTQ people throughout the entire existence of human history, as we know, and there's been some very powerful history about our forgotten ancestors, especially in the gay and lesbian community. Not nearly as much history has been told about people who identified as non-binary or transgender. And I feel like your book is coming out at a very powerful time because so much of this history isn't known. And that really goes against the argument of people who claim to be upholding traditional values and saying, this is something new and weird and wrong and didn't exist in history. And you were telling the story of a friend who, is a figure from 250 years ago and played a very prominent role in American history, in the history of equality, in the history of the birth of our nation. And I'm wondering, did this weigh on you at all as you were trying to tell this story?
Well, it really, it inspired me really to think that 250 years ago, Friend was dealing with so many of the issues we are still dealing with. What is the role of religion in society? What do we owe everyone in the community, even of diverse backgrounds? What do we owe people of diverse abilities? And of course, what does gender mean? What does identity mean? How does that play into equal rights? And Friend was able to create these communities where the minister really put into practice these ideals that we talk about, and yet we don't put into practice. Friend put them into practice and made them work, and the communities were prosperous. The communities were happy. Friend truly believed that the flesh is just this tabernacle for what's inside, and what's inside is what matters, which we all give a lot of lip service to, but let's really make the communities that we live in offer equal opportunities, offer these inalienable rights to everybody, not just to those whom certain people deem worthy. And what you say about how, we look back at our history and we have so much that we learn about John Hancock and George Washington, but Universal Friend was an important figure in American history. We should know about Universal Friend. And then we have, these figures like Ann Lee, the founder of the Shakers. A movie is made about Ann Lee, and it's a beautiful movie, but it's a fantasy. It's not a reality. Ann Lee was no feminist. Ann Lee did not believe in the equality of sexes. Ann Lee did not really care about what happened outside of the community that Ann Lee founded. So why are we not looking at the true history to get our inspiration? Why are we looking at fantasy? We really have to take a hard look at what we want to learn from history and how open we are to learning the full story.
So talk with us. How was Friend perceived in the greater community, and what was the reaction from their family, from some of their, former associates? I'm really interested in that because although they certainly had a following, I imagine that there was controversy.
There was a lot of controversy, of course. Within Friend's own family, a number of siblings joined the sect and became lifelong members of the sect, and very important, played in very important roles in the religious society. During the revolution, nobody really paid too much attention to Friend in terms of criticism, which is interesting because at the time, Quakers who were speaking out against the war were treated pretty badly. They were in prison. They were ostracized. They had a hard time. That did not happen to Friend. But after the war, when more followers were coming to the society, and not followers from sort of the lower classes, but influential men and women who had money and property and who were putting their all into Universal Friend, there started to be some concern among established ministers and some leaders of different towns, like in Philadelphia. There was a lot of concern that Universal Friend was coming to town and making trouble. And so there were public outcries against this person who didn't speak the way a woman should speak, who didn't dress the way a woman should dress, who claimed to be Jesus Christ, which Universal Friend never claimed to be, although definitely dressed in a way that evoked visions of Jesus Christ. So, the Universal Friend knew how to present to the crowd, how to gather the crowd, but also how to then gather, to incite some criticism. So there were accusations made against the society that were threatening. They were never violently attacked the way the Shakers were, but it was made clear they weren't really welcome to stay within the cities and towns where they were. So that also motivated them to move west, to found this community of equality, where also hopefully they would just be left to themselves. Now, in that, they became the largest Western settlement by 1790 in the Finger Lakes area of New York, which was basically the Western frontier at that time. And their neighbors there accepted the community because they didn't cause problems. They had good farms. They produced good produce. They were generous neighbors. They were helpful neighbors. So things went well until there began a huge land rush for Western New York, for the Western states, which meant that land values went up, which meant that certain followers who had come to Universal Friend as wealthy men and given up everything and moved west to these, and become farmers, they started to realize, maybe there's an opportunity here for me. Maybe I kind of miss being wealthy. Maybe it might be time to reject Universal Friend. And they did. And what's interesting is they had no problem with recognizing their minister as non-gendered when they were followers. But once they were interested in doing a land grab, they started calling their former minister a deluded woman. So then their minister became a woman. Before, they had accepted messenger of God. Now Friend was a deluded woman. And what followed were...
Being a deluded woman seemed to be a demotion from being the non-gendered preacher. Interesting.
Exactly. Someone you could attack, someone you didn't have to worry about, someone you were doing the world a favor, getting rid of her power in the world. So there ensued just decades of legal land battles, which Friend fought. And also two former followers brought about this whole endeavor, which was successful in having Universal Friend arrested for blasphemy. So this was in 1800, and they bring Universal Friend to court, and the court says, well, in this new country where we have freedom of religion, is there even such a thing as blasphemy? And the court decides, no, there isn't. Universal Friend is free to go, but first you want to say something to us. So Friend preached this whole sermon, and the judge is like, oh, that was great. And Friend went off. But what's interesting about that case, it wouldn't be until, I think it was 1926, that the Supreme Court held, that's right, there is no blasphemy. For the next, how many years that was, every single case of blasphemy was actually upheld in state and federal courts. So Universal Friend's case, which held that there couldn't be blasphemy in our new nation, was actually not followed until 1926. So that's a whole other part that I talk about in my book, about how this concept of freedom of religion, we quickly kind of smush that down to say, but we're talking about Christian religion, we're talking about making an oath on the Bible, we're not really, talking about freedom of all sort of expressions of religion. So, and just another interesting sidebar, and another way that Universal Friend story illustrates the history of our country. And what I try to do in all of my books is take one particular person or set of people or one family to illustrate a chapter in our history that we may not really understand or may not know enough about. So by looking at one person, it gives this broader view of what was going on in the United States from, after the war until 1820.
Now, you were talking about the Friend and their followers ended up in the Finger Lakes region of New York. That's also where Seneca Lake is in New York, which is known as the birth of the women's rights movement. I found that to be a fascinating part of the story.
Yes, I agree. And I make the connection at the end. I say it can be no coincidence that, Seneca Falls Convention was just upstream from where Universal Friend established these communities. Of course, that whole area became this wildly, it's called the burned out district, in the 19th century because of all the sects that flamed up there, including, of course, the Mormons started in that part of New York. But Universal Friend was really the first utopian utopian community. And what I found so inspiring about Friend was that it didn't have these crazy rules or outrageous claims, other than being a non-gendered messenger who had died and been reborn. But Friend believed it. That was no fraud there. It was just a community based on the ideals that we are still striving to live by. So we can look backwards and see solutions to problems that we're facing now. Maybe we can get some inspiration, or at least the belief that we can solve these problems. They're not insolvable. They're not impossible. And the answer isn't the separation of people who are different because they should be gone from our country. That would never have been accepted by any of the founders, and certainly not by Universal Friend.
We have so many sects of religion that have popped up in America, so many utopian movements over the years. I'm wondering, do you think that there is something uniquely American about that because of these ideals that we've all been struggling throughout our history to live up to, of freedom and equality? And do you feel like that has inspired these movements more here than, for instance, back in Europe, in England?
Right. That is such an interesting question. And I think you make a really good point, because you see many sects, people came from Europe and came from England because they felt in the United States there would be the freedom to pursue their ideals, and because they did think that people revered these ideals of freedom and self-determination and were less restricted than they may be in Europe, and that here was a celebration of really self-determination, which we can take to mean so many things. I mean, to be able to say who you are to the world is a very important and very elemental. It's something we all want, and something everyone around the world is looking for. This country hopefully still is a place where we can say, this is who I am. I'm accepted here. I have rights here. I have opportunities here. And I think you make a good point that these religious societies found fertile ground, not only in gathering followers, but in being accepted and not persecuted.
So kind of at the beginning of Friend's journey, we have the backdrop of the American Revolution, where 13 colonies are transforming into a new nation and a war is being fought. And then talk to us a little bit about how that shaped Friend's journey and where they ended up at the end of their life, and what was going on with our new nation during that period.
Right. Well, during the revolution, Friend was definitely influenced by the rhetoric of the revolution, the pamphlets that were going around, the speeches that were being made, and also active at the same time was a minister named George Whitfield, who was a Methodist evangelist preacher, who also spoke about the importance of self-determination and finding your way and being a voice for God and repenting. So hearing this language, and then also hearing language about, from Thomas Paine. So, Common Sense was America's first bestseller, and it's very likely that Jemima Wilkinson, who was Universal Friend, as a girl, would have read this. Quakers believed in education, so everyone in Jemima's family was educated. They read. They had a library in the house. Two of her brothers actually were expelled from the Quakers for going to join the Minutemen of Rhode Island and fighting for the American cause. So that would have been something that also, I don't want to say radicalized Universal Friend, but opened the young Jemima's mind to these possibilities that maybe you could leave the Quakers and you could find a new way to go. You could find a new path forward. So all of these revolutionary ideals definitely influenced Friend. And then Jemima undergoes the transformation and becomes this minister. And throughout the life of Universal Friend, you do see an evolution. You do see that in the beginning, there was more focus on, doomsday was coming, the end of the world was coming, Judgment Day was coming. As Friend sort of settles into being a minister and then settles on the Western frontier, and as America becomes a new nation, there's more of focus on how do we create communities that work? How do we create communities of faith, but that are also communities that support other, this new nation that we have? Not that Friend ever talked about politics. The minister never did, but the minister lived through these politics, lived through, the embargoes that started with, between England and Americans in the early years of the nation, when we had then the War of 1812. All of these things affected Western New York, affected Friend's neighbors, and Friend had to respond to that. So seeing how Friend responds to the contemporary situation, the evolution of the sermons also is a reflection of the evolution of American history. So what we were talking about before, looking at one person's experience, of course, it's going to reflect their experience in the United States. So by looking at their experience, we understand what was going on in the United States. And after Friend died in 1819, and for the next 40, 50 years in Western New York, there was just this proliferation of religious societies. Part of it had to do with that Western New York was suddenly opened up through canal systems. So all of these people could come to this beautiful God's country where they could do what, profess the faith that they wanted. But Friend did start that. Friend was there first, not there first in terms of Native Americans. And I do go into Universal Friend's relationship with Native Americans in my book, because it's an issue where, yes, Universal Friend lived on lands that had belonged to Native Americans, lands that were taken from them. Friend also tried to participate and help Native Americans who came back to Western New York to negotiate new land deals to get some of their land back. And one of those most important treaties is actually still in place today, and is one that is given the Native Americans in Western New York more rights to land than almost anywhere else. So it's another interesting side story. So you look at this one person story, but we can see so many threads of our American history through one person's life.
That's really fascinating. And it really struck me when you were talking about how your approach for some of your other work has been to look at one person or one family and to tell the story of the time and the complex issues. And I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of telling new stories, first of all, which is so remarkable at this point in history to be able to do that. Talk to us about your process of going through some of Friend's letters and writings and trying to piece together this story. And what was kind of the moment as you discovered them that you were like, you know what, this is a story in and of itself, and I really want to just dig into their life?
Well, as I say, I first discovered the story of Universal Friend researching my book just before this one. And I really wanted to pursue this story. And then COVID hit. And so this book really was the research really began literally like in March of 2020. So it was the beginning of COVID.
That's fascinating, given the birth of during typhoid.
Yeah. I just thought, I can't go to any libraries, I can't go to any archives. How am I going to get this done?
Mm-hmm.
And what I found were that there were librarians and archivists who were also wringing their hands saying, how are we going to get our work done? We want to get this information out. So people were incredibly helpful, scanning just documents and sending me huge files, which, with the letters of Universal Friend and diaries of followers and different land use records and court records. Just the amount of help that I had from people throughout New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. It really was an effort it was something that I could not have done without the help of all of these archivists and librarians who were willing to scour through everything, scan things, and send them to me. But it was not, and I knew I had a story, and I knew it was a great story, and I was very excited about it. But it wasn't until the May of 2021 that I was able to actually go to the Finger Lakes and see where Universal Friend had established these communities. And there is a wonderful little museum dedicated to Universal Friend in Penn Yan that has Universal Friend's medicine chest and velvet saddle and a beautiful portrait of Universal Friend and a bag that a French count had given the minister. Just all of these objects. It made it so real and so immediate. To actually visit these places makes it so amazing. Like when I was writing American Rebels, to go to the John Adams, National Historic Park, was amazing to see his house. And so I really felt that in the Finger Lakes. And Universal Friend's final house, the last house which the minister lived in, is still standing in Keuka Lake. A Mennonite family lives there, which I think is so interesting. They have, horse and buggy. They don't use any cars. So there's this wonderful continuation of a spiritual, existence. So sorry, there's a cat. The process for me, I always like to actually have the real documents in my hand. And so during COVID, that was difficult until 2021. Then I could start to go and see the actual letters and see the actual journals that were kept. And that always just excites me and makes me more eager to tell the story. And I'm sorry about this. Okay.
No, we're very pet friendly here.
Okay.
It's always fun when they join the family. We've had dogs, we've had kids.
Okay.
Worries at all. Well, that's a fascinating part of the process. That's something that I've always enjoyed because, it's a joy to read things, but when you get to see where people lived and sometimes, there aren't that many people who have laid eyes on some of their belongings and visited their childhood homes. And I feel like that brings a real immediately and a connection to the process.
Yes.
So that's fascinating to hear what your process is. I've really just so enjoyed hearing about your book and the book, just again, I think we've got the cover, is Not Your Founding Father: How a Non-Binary Minister Became America's most radical revolutionary.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating read, probably one of the more unique books you could read about this country's history during the 250th anniversary. Nina, thank you for joining us and taking so much time to tell us about the book and your process.
Thank you very much, Susan. It was really nice talking to you. Thank you.